Learning about mangroves in school at that point.
Right.
And that made us think about coming up with a solution that would help people and the environment. And I think that really blew up into something that became like a lifelong passion.
How much more news and politics takes precedence in my life, and this is a very important part of how we live in harmony with the ecology around us.
A lot of people did try planting mangroves, but if you don't understand how it grows, especially that you can't just plonk it in a little, hole and just expect it to grow.
Yeah. So if you were to talk about policy, environmental policy, where do you think Sri Lanka stands and where do you think we need to move forward?
So many things are just happening where people are not really thinking about how their actions have repercussions.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we don't have that kind of time if you really look at the world where we are at right now.
Do you think media is doing enough? Like, do you think that they need to do more?
If you look at how other countries are working, they collaborate. And something that I wish Sri Lanka was part of is SIDS. Oh, that's a great question. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say it's at a 3 right now.
That's bad.
Yeah, it's pretty bad.
Well, the good thing is you're young and you have a long time to keep making the changes that you're making. I am not going to ask you to point fingers, particularly in particular, but I would ask you, I'll phrase it this way, what do you think Sri Lanka could do better? Hello and welcome to the debrief with me, Roel Raymond. I have with me someone who, despite her young age, is making a mark in the fields of environment and conservation, Anoka Abeyratne. Hi Anoka.
Hi Roel, thank you so much for having me here.
Not at all, I'm very happy to have you here. Like I said to you before, this is the first interview I've had with anyone relating to environment and conservation, and that is a reflection of the fact that perhaps environment and conservation don't have the place that they should have in society and in conversations. And it's a wake-up call for me as well. I've realized how little I know about the environment and conservation, or let's put it this way, how much more news and politics takes precedence in my life, and this is a very important part of how we live in harmony with the ecology around us. So Anoka, I'm going to start with asking you some of the most basic questions. How did you get into this field? Was it something you were passionate about from the time you were a child? Or did something happen while you were growing up that really made you think, I want to commit my life towards this?
So a lot of things really. I was always empathetic towards animals, and that's something that I've always wanted to be a part of. So growing up, I wanted to become a vet. At one point, a veterinarian.
Yeah.
But I mean, a lot of things happened, like the tsunami, which really changed the trajectory that my life went on.
Right.
Because we were just learning about mangroves in school at that point.
Right.
And that made us think about coming up with a solution that would help people and the environment. And I think that really blew up into something that became like a lifelong passion.
Right. So as I understand it, mangroves is your key area of focus.
Yes.
I do know how mangroves help, but just for the sake of our audience who may or may not know, can we have a brief summary of why mangroves are so important to the environment?
Sure. So mangroves are a specific species that grow near lagoons and areas where you have a mixture of salty and fresh water. And a lot of these species, there are so many varieties like Bruguiera, and a lot of these species are so important to make sure that you have the freshwater species like fish, crabs, shrimp. It helps them like grow by providing like a safe environment for them to breed, and it also keeps the soil together and cleans the water. So there's so many benefits that come out of it. So
some time ago there was a government initiative, right, to plant mangroves around the coast or something like. Do you remember anything come of it? Is it a fruitful project?
I mean, so this was, I think, a lot of advocacy at work for over 10 years that kind of led to it becoming a part of protected species through policy. So in 2019, there was a legislative gazette that was put out saying that it's now a protected species. And I think a lot of people did try planting mangroves, but if you don't understand how it grows, especially that you can't just plonk it in a little, hole and just expect it to grow, you have to make sure that that it historically grew there, or that that species is adapted to that area, things like that. It doesn't really become successful in terms of replantation.
Right. So if I were to ask you to give me, I know that we do, like I said, I come from a news and politics background.
Yes.
So for, if environment makes it to the news, it's around things like highways, or perhaps one of the forests or something like that. But if I were to ask you to give me like an overview on what the environment situation in Sri Lanka is looking like, even if you were to rate it, like how would you say it is? Like, what is your overview or take on everything?
Oh, that's a great question. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I would say it's at a 3 right now.
That's bad.
Yeah, it's pretty bad because I think with COVID and everything else going on, people are not really paying a lot of attention to it, and it's become like a very short-sighted thing. You just throw your mask outside sometimes. You don't think it could get entangled in the beak of a bird. It could kill those birds. Lots of different things, like even like throwing fishing nets in the water. So many things are just happening where people are not really thinking about how their actions have repercussions on the natural world.
Yeah, because it's the least important thing to them, right? Like for them, they'd rather think about how to get their next meal on the table. And those are fair concerns, but these are also very important things. And I know, like I said, we do a lot of stories and articles around this sort of thing, but what I see is missing, and this is, I think, the area that you're involved in, is the policy framework that can can address all of these areas with one framework. So if you were to talk about policy, environmental policy, where do you think Sri Lanka stands, and where do you think we need to move forward?
So we do have some draft policies that are going on. For example, the National Clean Act, then there is also the Environmental Act. So some of these have existed for a while, some since like the 1800s kind of thing, which are part of the British laws that came in, etc. But some of them have been updated, but I don't think it's enough.
Okay.
Because if you really look at the kind of fines that you have, some of them are like, you can cut down even like a protected species and get away with it. So you need to have like better fines, well actually really strong. What I mean is like really strong fines, and also to kind of make sure that there are long-term repercussions for harming the environment, as opposed to saying, you just pay bail and get out. So,
but what would you say to people who argue that it's not a crime? Or, you know what I'm saying? If you look at it very practically, there may be people who would say, why would someone need to be put into prison for something like how would you argue something? Or is there would you be able to even imagine a punishment or some sort of repercussion so it's a consequence definitely to the action, but maybe not as bad as being put behind bars? So community service, something like replanting. Do you think that if you think out, like if policymakers like yourself were able to think out of the box, perhaps you'll be able to change people's opinion about how important or not it is to punish people flouting environmental laws?
I mean, that's a wonderful idea for sure. So unfortunately in Sri Lanka, you don't have that aspect, like sort of, providing community service as something that you could, provide instead of jailing or fining, which, I mean, I would love to see that happen here. But yes, I mean, if you understand, like for example, you sometimes get elephants with their tusks chopped off, and it's just really horrible. And something that we seem to forget is the economical returns that we get from nature, like the Sri Lankan wildlife, all of it. Like there's nothing like that in the world, and that's the reason why so many people keep coming here despite all the challenges. And
actually we were recently featured on the I Lead panel, and at the time you said something that really resonated with me. You said people come for, like you just explained, for nature. And when I was making my speeches, is something I remembered, because a couple of weeks before I had put up an Instagram poll about if you wanted to forget politics, what are the things you like about Sri Lanka? And everybody talked about the sea, the hills, nature, the sea, the hills, nature. It just completely, the poll was entirely about how much they loved nature.
Yes.
So it really made me think, besides the drama of politics and whatever, people do love, and actually what's important about Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka's identity is nature. So okay, let's talk about your advocacy, because you're involved in that sort of thing. What are the biggest challenges you see in terms of advocacy? Do you think that media needs to help some more? Do you think that people need to be more educated? I know these are, I suppose all of them are included, but yeah, where do you come from?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, so what happens with advocacy is sometimes it takes a long period of time, and unfortunately we don't have that kind of time if you really look at the world where we are at right now. And yes, the media plays such a big role. For example, when we were doing the animal welfare bill, a lot of young people, like, we were all working together to push it forward and, speak with the MP who was in charge of it at the time, etc. And I think kind of featuring it in papers and things really helped, because it kind of gave like a win-win for the politicians as well, because they were like, oh yeah, my face is going on.
They're getting, so they're getting some mileage from it. Yeah.
So they were kind of like keen to support, because it was good for them as well. So I mean, the role of even digital media in kind of like getting it out there, like when we created the petition, like the signatures, all of it kind of contributed to show that people were concerned, and that was the people speaking.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great way to engage with the politicians, but do you think media is doing enough? Like, do you think that they need to do more? Or is it just you all engaging and then the media turns their attention to environmental issues, or do you feel that the media itself as a whole, I'm saying, are interested or invested in environment as much as they need to?
Definitely not enough.
Yeah.
I mean, like, when we spoke as well, I think we kind of realized that environment doesn't feature so much because it's not seen as high priority. But given where the world is, I do think media can do a lot more, like, from documentaries or understanding how certain species grew in Sri Lanka, even traditional species, and how the relationship between those and the people, how it worked, all of those things I think are
and how this
amazing.
Even ties to the pandemic, right?
Yes.
Because that's exactly how all of this came about. And social media would be very important, I guess, for the younger generations to understand if we create, little bites of this kind of information. So that's, it'll be good to work with you going forward, I hope. I'll send you a proposal. Besides that, I had meant to actually speak more about you and less about policy and stuff like that, but this is an area that even I'm interested in, because like I said, it hasn't featured much and it needs to feature a lot more. But now let's go to you. How you studied law initially, yes, and then I think you mentioned that it was during the tsunami that you actually felt that there was a need to get into environment. So you're from Kandy.
So I have roots, but I've lived mostly in Colombo.
In Colombo, yeah, and you studied at Bishop's College, my school as well. I have to drop that in. So what was it? What was it like in school? What were your experiences like growing up? Just tell me a little bit about your life. Yeah.
Sure. So I was a very nerdy kid.
Okay.
Right. So I used to mind my own business, read all the books, all of it, but I think because of all the clubs and societies, I got really involved in things like even sports. I used to do athletics at one point and swimming.
Okay.
But I think it was the environmental club and the UN club that really got me like super into kind of figuring out, hey, like, you have environment, you have policy, how can you do more? Like bringing people together, understanding what you can do more, and kind of interacting with other people in other schools as well, because you get to go to all these little mini conferences like MUN, etc. All of those things.
Were like socializing. I remember at that point where I was in school also, that was the part that I wasn't very good at. So then you transformed into this, and then your master's you did in?
Yes, so I did it at Cambridge, and so it was mostly focused on business, but also on innovation and sustainability.
Right, so this is the entrepreneurship part.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So what was the idea behind it? Were you planning on, is it a backup, or were you planning on getting into some kind of environment type thing, or? No?
So it was never a backup.
Okay.
So because for me, I always saw environment as not being just something that's donor driven, because you can't really keep expecting like someone else to fund it.
Yeah.
So that was the way of looking at it from a social business, social enterprise kind of perspective.
Right.
Yeah.
And when did you return to Sri Lanka, Anoka?
So it's been, I think, so I came just before like all the lockdown and
Oh,
everything happened.
Yeah.
I think after that, kind of
Yeah.
like stayed
Yeah,
stuck.
yeah. Had to be restricted to the home.
Yeah.
Yes, but I'm excited because it seems like you have a lot of you have the expertise it takes to do a lot. So I'll be excited to see what will happen, especially now that COVID is not as challenging as it
Yes.
once was.
Thank God for that.
Yes. So do you have any plans that I can ask of, or do you want to keep it under wraps for the moment?
So I mean, we're just kind of looking at creating conservation sites. I'm also following something with the university, Yale University. So they want to look at tropic conservation, and one of the professors is actually, he has a Sri Lankan parent,
Okay, interesting.
someone who migrated during the World War and all of that. So he's very keen on looking at Sri Lanka and contributing to tropical conservation here. So
Nice, yeah.
kind of understanding how you get these corridors between reserves. So kind of looking at how to conserve it, regrow it, all of those things. So
And
exciting
will you
stuff.
expand in the sense from, I know like you explained to me before that conservation is more specific. Or
Yes.
I was going to ask you this question and I forgot. Can you tell me the difference between being an environmentalist and a conservationist?
Sure. So a conservationist is definitely a lot more specialized in the sense that you would look at conserving a species like an elephant or a leopard in a specific area, or even in another ex situ area where you look at a zoo or a national park or something like that. Whereas an environmentalist can be anybody or anything, even someone writing about the environment to, you know, looking at selling fashionable clothing that's sustainable as well.
Yeah. So you had featured, I mean, you had focused on mangroves before. That was when you were much younger.
Yes.
But now I think you broadened your spectrum, or you broadened your interests, because you told me you were interested in policy.
Yes.
And now, so in terms of policy, what would you think you need to do? Like, what's your next step?
So currently, I mean, we've been going through a lot of the documentation, kind of looking at fine-tuning the wording, trying to make sure that it's not too vague, because what happens is once it becomes policy, you know how tough it is to add an amendment or change it. So really kind of like going through all that processes, kind of speaking to people who want to make that difference. And it's tough, it's not easy at all, and it takes time. So yeah, that's what's happening.
Well, the good thing is you're young. And you have a long time to keep making the changes that you're making. And I'm impressed by the fact that you worked all this time to, how do I put this, to get your arsenal together, if that makes sense. You know, you've got your law degree, you've got everything that you need, you're piling it up in layers, everything that you need to actually make an impact. And if people think you're making an impact now, it's like, wait and see what's going to come. Okay, so you were talking about tropical reforestation, and that's what you're studying right now. And I suppose if we were to look at Sri Lanka as the tiny island that it is in the Indian Ocean, where do you think we stand or we rank or rate in terms of how we are using and protecting our biodiversity to our advantage? Do you have an idea on where we stand there? Or?
So we're not doing so great,
to
be very honest. But there's so much more that we can do, because if you look at how other countries are working, they collaborate. And something that I wish Sri Lanka was part of is SIDS, which is the Small Island Developing States. It's like an alliance or a union of really small countries like Micronesia, Vanuatu, Fiji, all these countries, and you get a lot of benefits. Like, for example, just recently Cambridge opened up 10 scholarships for climate action for these countries, and it really helps young people get that skill set, the understanding of how to help their own countries. And even when it comes to policy, when you speak as a group, you have a bigger say, because it's a collective response. So little things like that. I mean, I wish that, you know, Sri Lanka could be part of these things that will help us kind of not just help ourselves, but help everybody at the same time.
And speaking of that small island thingy, I was wondering, how does tourism play into, I'm assuming tourism is quite closely linked with what you all do, because it's, like we said, it's what Sri Lanka sells, the environment and nature and stuff like that. So I am not going to ask you to point fingers, particularly in particular, but I would ask you, I'll phrase it this way, what do you think Sri Lanka could do better?
so much,
Okay.
because I mean, there's this problem of greenwashing that comes up a lot, where even like a lot of hotels, they say we're eco-friendly, but I personally seen they use a lot of plastics, because you can, I mean, there are some groups that are really sustainable. They have all these containers that they refill. Most of them are glass, or they have like fixed ones that they can keep refilling. So they really go that extra mile, but I know some really don't, and it's terrible the way they kind of portray themselves as sustainable. And I know that when tourists sometimes come, they see the level of greenwashing and they get disappointed, because what you really want as a country to provide is also that honesty.
Correct.
And that transparency.
Correct.
So I think that is super important as well, when you look at tourism. And I mean, you would have seen like a lot of scenarios where you have even like jeeps in certain national parks going and harassing animals. Even I saw like a sloth bear. He was just trying to walk across in Yale. And like the jeeps just went and like, you know, really like tried to cut him off. They were going back and forth just to make sure that people would get footage of him walking.
Terrible. Yeah.
So all of these things really need to change to make sure that people don't get disgusted when they come here, and that they never return after that.
Because I was going to ask you, I feel that even tourists, there's this sort of awakening consciousness, right, about the environment and stuff like that. So if Sri Lanka keeps going the way it is, where with minimal and minimum respect to the environment, it's not going to be very sustainable going forward, because even the biggest industry, tourism, is not going to, it's not going to reap the benefits it should. And of course, there are other issues related to tourism, but let's just talk about the environmental factor here. So it's good, and I think even though I do see that social media is a double-edged sword, in that it can be very useful, but at the same time very harmful. I do think that this sort of awakening consciousness of people, where they are very conscious, like I said, about what they do. And the sad part is, Anoka, is that I could be, me personally, I could be very conscious about my use of plastic, but I also don't have I don't have an option. I don't know what to do. So that is something I think maybe people need to think about, like offering alternatives and stuff like that. Where do you see that industry?
Definitely. I mean, because it also becomes a bit of a privilege issue if you look at it. Like, it's so easy to be like, hey, why don't you take a bunch of glass bottles to the supermarket? But if you think about it, it's heavy, and you can't take them in a bus or a tuk or anything, because it takes a lot of space, and you would have to probably drive there. And how many people can afford to do that, especially nowadays? So it's really about providing subsidies for industries that are looking at alternatives, things that are made out of wheat germ, or even out of things like, for example, the beer, like when you make beer, you get the residue, you can turn it into like things like cutlery, all of that. And it's really about kind of making sure that you support that instead of shutting it down and letting the plastics lobby be out there.
I hear you. I think we should focus on investing more in the alternatives, because I know that, like I said, people want to but have no options. Also, when it comes to even waste management, that's a whole other issue. Waste is separated here in Colombo, but I hear that even after it's separated, it's just dumped altogether. And the impact that has on the environment. And besides this, like you said, it is a privilege issue, because people who can afford to will buy even cosmetics that are environmentally friendly or animal friendly, but not everybody can afford that lifestyle, or even it's not high on the priority list. So these things need to change, but unfortunately it seems a long way off. But what do you think about the pandemic as a reset? Do you think the pandemic served as a reset in some ways to slow down the way things, the speed at which people moved?
In many ways, yes, because now a lot of people use Zoom over, for example, going for like maybe 2 hours on the road to have a meeting, like back and forth. People also look at maybe, not necessarily having a lot of things, but just the necessities. And so there's been a bit of a mindset change. And like when you said like it might be a long way off, if you like, for example, look at TikTok, or like a lot of people who are kind of becoming more conscious about the things they use, the brands they associate with, people are, like you said, becoming a lot more environmentally conscious, because they don't want to kind of like lose their followers,
Yes,
or
yes.
you know, they don't want to be
It's also
seen.
politically correct.
Yeah, and like they don't want to be shamed for using a
Yeah.
plastic straw.
Correct, correct. Fair
So
enough.
there's a lot that comes up, which is quite, I mean, really great, I think.
Yeah.
So I do hope that continues.
Yeah, interesting conversation, and thank you for educating me as much as everybody else watching this. I would really like to stay more in touch with you, Anoka, because I think you have a wealth of. I'm grateful that you chose to stick to what you are passionate about, even though it's not something that it's something that's ignored quite often by the public and even policymakers. And it needs people like you to sort of stand resolutely. You may not be the loudest voice out there, but just standing, I really firmly believe that you don't need to have a loud voice. You just need to stand resolutely in one place, and that in itself is enough sometimes to change the tide. Thank you very much for joining me on the debrief, and very nice to have met you.
Thank you so much for having me. I loved it. So thank you.
Awesome.